My friends, we come together today not to gather new information, not to add more concepts to an already crowded mind, but to awaken to a truth that has been present within us from the beginning. And the truth is this, that what we have so often called seeking guidance, seeking answers, or seeking God has been based on a profound misunderstanding of the nature of spiritual reality. For generations, sincere seekers have approached prayer as though God were somewhere else, as though divine wisdom must be summoned, persuaded, or awakened before the answer can appear. But I must tell you, this is not the way of spirit. God does not begin to function when we begin to pray. God does not wait for our words before grace is set in motion. The activity of the infinite is eternally present, eternally complete, lacking nothing, withholding nothing. What appears to us as unanswered prayer is not the absence of God's response, but the absence of our recognition. And so the great spiritual tragedy is this. We stand at the edge of an ever-flowing fountain, thirsting, pleading for water, unaware that the fountain has been flowing all the while. The divine presence is not something to be achieved. It is something to be realized. It is not something to call forth. It is something to awaken to. This is the beginning of our journey today, the recognition that God's answers do not come into being because we ask. God's answers are. They are the perpetual expression of a presence that knows no beginning, no interruption, and no delay. Therefore, the purpose of spiritual practice is not to bring God into the situation, but to bring our consciousness into alignment with what God already is. And if you can grasp even a trace of this idea, that divine fullness exists here and now, you will begin to feel the soft dissolving of fear, the melting away of anxious effort, the loosening of that inner tension that so often accompanies religious striving. We are not here to try to make something happen. We are here to discover what has never ceased happening. And so let us proceed gently, quietly, into the heart of this teaching, that we may come to see for ourselves the profound reality of the divine. Already the truth that God's presence, God's guidance, and God's answer are forever established, awaiting only the stillness in which we recognize them. Let us move now into the heart of this principle I have called the divine already, for unless this truth is clearly understood, all spiritual practice remains entangled in effort and expectation. You see, the infinite way teaches a simple but revolutionary truth, that God is not becoming, God is not developing, God is not preparing something for you in the future. God is the eternal isness, complete, whole, perfect, lacking nothing and withholding nothing. Everything that God is now. And everything that God expresses is already established within the invisible kingdom that Jesus referred to when he said, "The kingdom of God is within you." This kingdom does not come into being through prayer. It does not unfold because of our spiritual techniques. It is not granted as a reward for good behavior or withheld as punishment. The kingdom is an ever-present reality that the human mind simply has not learned to perceive. When you understand this, even dimly, you begin to see why so many prayers appear to go unanswered. It is not that God is silent. It is not that heaven is withholding its blessings. It is that we have approached prayer as though God must act, rather than as though we must awaken. For God's action is never absent. God does not move in tides of generosity and restraint. Divine harmony is perpetual. Divine life is perpetual. Divine supply is perpetual. It is our inner awareness that fluctuates, not God's availability. And so the principle of the divine already invites us to rest. Rest from the belief that we must persuade the infinite to take notice of us. Rest from imagining that God is somewhere afar off, needing to be summoned. rest from the weary sense that spiritual blessings must be achieved or earned. In reality, the activity of God cannot be increased, decreased, hurried, or delayed. The fullness of divine presence is here now as the very fabric of our being. But until we become still enough, quiet enough, receptive enough to recognize this presence, it remains to us as though God were absent, not absent in truth, only absent in our awareness. This recognition is the beginning of spiritual grace. It is the dawning of a new way of living, where prayer is no longer a pleading for something to happen, but a resting in what eternally is. When the mind stops insisting, demanding, or outlining, when it grows silent enough to perceive the gentle flow of divine wisdom already at work, then the answers that seemed distant become clear. The guidance that felt hidden becomes unmistakable, and the harmony we believe we must create reveals itself as already established within us. This is the divine, already the truth, that God's fullness exists before, during, and after every prayer, requiring only our recognition to become visible in our experience. And so, as we proceed, let us hold fast to this foundation. We do not bring God to us, we awaken to God already here. Now that we have established this foundational truth, that God's presence and God's answers are already here, we must look honestly, gently, compassionately at the question, if the answer is already present, why do we not perceive it? This is not a matter of judgment, nor of failure. It is simply a matter of understanding how the human mind functions when it believes itself to be separate from the divine. The moment we accept the belief in separation, the belief that I am here and God is somewhere else, we enter a state of consciousness filled with noise, effort, fear, expectation, and personal will. And in that noise, the subtle whisper of the Spirit is drowned out. You see, the human mind is forever projecting its own concepts outward, creating images of how life ought to unfold, imagining the form an answer must take, and outlining the exact way in which God must perform. In this state, the mind is not listening, it is dictating, it is not receptive, it is asserting. And so the divine impulse, which often comes as a gentle nudge, a quiet realization, a soft inner knowing, cannot be recognized because consciousness is too occupied with its own ideas to perceive the reality that is already here. Think for a moment of how often we approach prayer with a particular outcome in mind, a job we want, a healing to occur in a certain way, a relationship to mend according to our blueprint. And then we wonder why guidance seems obscure. The answer is not obscure. It is simply different from what the mind expects. Spirit never operates according to the limited patterns of human desire. Spirit reveals itself in ways that transcend our imagination, but the mind, locked into its own images, cannot recognize the answer because it does not match the picture it created. Another barrier to recognition is fear, that deep, often unconscious fear, that if we release control, if we stop dictating outcomes, life may unfold in a way we do not prefer. Fear tightens consciousness. Fear contracts the inner space through which spiritual realization dawns. When the thought life is dominated by what if and how will I, and suppose the worst happens, the mind becomes a storm. And in a storm, even the strongest beacon of light appears dim. Then there is the subtle but pervasive belief that God is responsive, that God hears, evaluates, decides, and then acts. This belief is the root of spiritual blindness, for it keeps the seeker waiting for something to happen instead of recognizing what is already happening. As long as we believe God must be persuaded to answer, we will continue to overlook the divine activity that is already operating in the quiet depths of our own being. And so it is not that God's answer is missing, it is that we are not yet still enough, quiet enough, surrendered enough to perceive it. The Infinite Way teaches that divine guidance is always present, always flowing, always available. But it can be perceived only by the receptive consciousness, the consciousness that has released its personal agenda and stands open, like an uncluttered field, waiting not for something new to be created, but for the ever-present to be revealed. If we can understand this, that the barrier lies not in God's silence, but in our inner noise, then we begin to approach spiritual practice from a higher standpoint. We no longer cry out into the void. We become listeners. We no longer demand answers. We become receptive to the wisdom already moving in us. We no longer attempt to direct spirit. We yield to the divine impulse that is forever seeking to express itself through us. This is why the answers of God so often seem invisible, not because they are absent, but because we are still looking outward when the answer lives within. Let us now turn to this word stillness, for it is the doorway through which all spiritual recognition enters. And yet, stillness is so deeply misunderstood that seekers often attempt to cultivate it through effort, strain, or techniques that only increase the very mental activity they hope to quiet. Stillness, in the spiritual sense, is not the absence of sound. It is not the attempt to empty the mind. It is, rather, the gentle dissolving of one's reliance on the thinking process, the release of personal will, the softening of the ego's grasp, and the opening of the heart to the realization of a presence that has been here all along. Jesus did not say, "Be still and I will come." He said, "Be still and know that I am God." The stillness is not a preparation for God's arrival. It is the condition in which we awaken to the God that is already present. The divine presence whispers continually, but it can be heard only when the mind has ceased insisting, ceased fearing, ceased outlining, ceased reaching outward. In that moment of inner quiet, however brief, something becomes perceptible, a subtle assurance, a gentle warmth, a sense of safety that does not arise from human reasoning. This is the first movement of recognition. Stillness is not an achievement. It is a surrender. It is the willingness to set aside, even for a moment, the belief that life depends upon our thinking, our planning, our striving, or our strength. When we enter stillness, we step into the awareness that there is an infinite, invisible presence, an intelligence which operates through us when we stop interfering. It is not passive. It is not resignation. It is profound receptivity, the receptive attitude that makes possible the discernment of divine guidance. You may have noticed that whenever the mind is racing with anxieties or busy outlining the future, the sense of God seems distant. This is not because God is distant, but because awareness is too filled with personal thought to perceive the quiet movements of spirit. But the moment we withdraw attention from the noise, not by fighting it, not by suppressing it, but by gently turning toward the inner stillness that exists beneath it, we discover a remarkable thing. Beneath the turbulence of thought, there is a vast, quiet space that has always been present. This inner silence is not created. It is discovered. It is not the product of discipline. It is the natural state of the soul when it ceases identifying with the activity of the mind. And in that silence, the divine already becomes discernible. The answers that once felt far away begin to rise, not in the form of words or voices, but as a knowing, a certainty that seems to come from nowhere, or rather from everywhere. Stillness is the condition in which the divine activity becomes visible. Without it, we are like a lake whipped by wind, unable to reflect the light of the sun. But when the waters become still, even for a moment, they mirror the sky. So it is with us. When thought settles, when the inner atmosphere becomes quiet, the presence reveals itself not through effort but through grace. You may have noticed that whenever the mind is racing with anxieties or busy outlining the future, the sense of God seems distant. This is not because God is distant, but because awareness is too filled with personal thought to perceive the quiet movements of spirit. Let us go another step deeper, for even after one has touched the silence, there remains a subtle obstacle that prevents the recognition of the divine already. This obstacle is the mind's tendency to form images, mental pictures of how the answer must appear, the shape it must take, and the path through which it must come. And I tell you gently, but with clarity, as long as you hold these mental pictures, you cannot behold the activity of God, for you are looking at your own projections instead of the spiritual reality that stands behind them. The human mind, by its very nature, constructs forms. It imagines the improvement. It desires a specific person to arrive, a particular sum of money to come, a predicted outcome to unfold. It then clings to these mental images as though they were divine decrees, believing that God must manifest in precisely these forms. But Spirit has no need of our pictures. Spirit, being infinite, has ways of fulfillment that transcend our imagination. Let us go another step deeper, for even after one has touched the silence, there remains a subtle obstacle that prevents the recognition of the divine already. This obstacle is the mind's tendency to form images, mental pictures of how the answer must appear, the shape it must take, and the path through which it must come. Imagine standing before a window through which sunlight shines, but covering that window with drawings of the sun. The drawings may be beautiful, but they obscure the light. The mind's pictures operate in the same manner. They cover the window of consciousness with imagined forms, and then we wonder why the light cannot be seen. The light is not absent, the window is simply covered. When we speak of removing mental images, we do not speak of denying our desires or pretending we have no preferences. We speak of releasing our grip on the demand that fulfillment must come in the form we have constructed. We speak of becoming spiritually flexible, inwardly malleable, open to the boundless creativity of divine wisdom. For the moment we let go of the insistence that the answer must be this, we create the inner space in which the presence can reveal the answer that is. This is why, in the spiritual life, we often say, ask once and then rest. To ask is human. To rest is spiritual. Ask once, not repeatedly, not anxiously, not as though God must be reminded, but once from a quiet place within, and then release the mental picture. Let the matter pass out of your hands entirely. Do not return to it with fear or speculation. Do not outline the method or the timing. Instead, sink back into the stillness, trusting that the infinite invisible is already functioning in ways that the mind cannot perceive. For when the mental picture dissolves, awareness becomes clear. It becomes receptive. It becomes capable of perceiving the subtle, gentle movements of divine intelligence, movements that were always present but hidden behind the thick veil of personal desire and conceptual thinking. And so, the removal of mental images is not an act of deprivation. It is an act of liberation. It frees us from the confinement of the small, limited self and opens us to the infinite ways of God. When the mind no longer dictates the form, the heart becomes able to recognize the substance, the spiritual answer that has been waiting quietly for our recognition. This, too, is part of living in the divine already. letting go of every mental picture so that the spiritual reality may be seen, felt, and lived. To illuminate this principle more fully, let us look at a few simple experiences, not miraculous in the worldly sense, not meant to impress or astonish, but intended to reveal a consistent pattern in the spiritual life. These stories illustrate what happens when one releases the mental picture, enters the stillness, and begins to recognize the divine already operating beneath the surface of appearances. There was a woman who came seeking spiritual help for what she believed was a severe financial crisis. She had tried every method she knew, affirmations, visualizations, constant prayer, all with the hope of forcing a particular solution to arrive. If only this one door would open, she said, everything would be all right. And so her entire consciousness was fixed upon that one door, and while she watched it day after day, willing it to move, she failed to notice the quiet opportunities already present in her life. When she learned to rest, to sit in stillness, without insisting, without outlining, something remarkable happened, though not in the way she expected. A friend casually mentioned an opportunity she had ignored for months, believing it to be insignificant. But now, something within her recognized it. She took a single step, and that one step unfolded into a new avenue of supply that was far more stable and fulfilling than anything she had imagined. The door she had fixated upon never opened, because it did not need to. The answer was already present. Her recognition was delayed only by her insistence on the form it must take. Another individual came seeking relief from a chronic condition. For years he had prayed for healing, yet always from the standpoint of fear that the condition would worsen, fear that his prayer might not be answered. He lived in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for God to do something, to change something, to intervene. When he was introduced to the principle of resting in the divine already, he began to approach his practice differently. Instead of pleading for the body to improve, he began sitting each day in quiet acknowledgement. God is the life of me now. There is no distance between the life of God and the life I am living. He was not praying for healing. He was recognizing wholeness. Over time, a subtle shift occurred. His fear dissolved, first not the condition, but the fear. Then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the symptoms began to lessen. They did not vanish overnight, but his awareness changed. He no longer lived as one fighting a condition. He lived as one sustained by a presence that had always been there, and the healing unfolded in the rhythm of grace. A third example, a woman yearning for harmony in her relationships. For years she had prayed for certain people to change, for circumstances to adjust, for others to understand her better. Her attention was fixed outward on behavior, on personalities, on situations. When she learned that her task was not to change others, but to realize the divine love already functioning within her own consciousness, everything shifted. She began to sit in quiet recognition. Love is the nature of my being. I need not create love nor seek it. It is already the fabric of what I am. Without any deliberate effort to influence others, her relationships began to transform. Conversations softened, tensions dissolved, new connections formed, and she realized with quiet awe that harmony had always been present. It was her fear and her effort that had obscured it. In each of these examples, the divine activity was not created, it was recognized. The answer was already present. The only thing missing was the awareness of it. Once stillness was entered, once the mental picture dissolved, once the sense of separation faded, recognition came, and with recognition, the outward experience aligned with the inner truth. These stories are not exceptional. They are not the experiences of unusually gifted individuals. They are simply illustrations of what occurs whenever consciousness relaxes its grip on the human picture and opens to the infinite invisible. They reveal a universal truth. The moment recognition dawns, the answer that was always there becomes visible in our experience. Now that we have seen how recognition transforms experience, let us turn to the practice that makes such recognition possible, a practice Joel Goldsmith often called resting in the Word. This is not a technique. It is not a formula. It is, rather, a way of entering into the awareness of God's presence without strain, without demand, without expectation. It is a quiet abiding in spiritual truth until that truth becomes more real to us than the appearances of the senses. When we speak of the Word, we refer not to a phrase repeated mechanically, nor to an affirmation designed to persuade God. We speak of a spiritual principle, a statement of truth that reveals the nature of God and, therefore, the nature of our own being. Something as simple as, I and the Father are one, or God is the life of me, or where I am, God is. These statements are not meant to change God. They are meant to quiet the mind long enough for us to perceive what is already true. And so the practice of resting in the Word begins with selecting one spiritual truth that speaks to the need of the moment, not a truth that promises a specific outcome, but a truth that dissolves the belief in separation. Let us say, for example, that you are facing confusion, uncertainty, or a sense of being directionless. The human mind wants to force clarity, to demand answers, to plan and anticipate. Instead, you sit quietly and bring into your awareness the truth. Infinite intelligence is here. Not will be, not might be is here. You rest in that truth. You do not outline how intelligence should express itself. You do not ask for a sign. You simply let the mind and body relax into that awareness. At first it may feel mechanical, for the mind is accustomed to activity. But as you continue gently, without pushing, the truth begins to settle into consciousness. A softness comes, a spaciousness, and in that spaciousness, the divine impulse can make itself known, or perhaps you feel fear or insecurity. You might rest in the truth. God is the strength of my life. You are not asking for more strength. You are recognizing that divine strength is already present as your very being. Slowly, the emotional agitation quiets and a sense of inward assurance arises, not because you have summoned it, but because you have become still enough to perceive it. For those seeking guidance or facing a difficult decision, one might rest in a truth like, the Father within me knoweth. This is not a plea for direction. It is an acknowledgement that the infinite invisible, the very essence of wisdom, is already functioning within you. And as you rest in that truth, the frantic demand for answers dissolves, making way for quiet inner knowing. The important point is this: you do not repeat the Word to get something. You rest in the Word to become aware of what already is. This is why Goldsmith taught that the Word should never be forced. If you find the mind wandering, you gently return to the truth. If thoughts arise, you do not fight them. You simply let them pass, returning to the awareness of spiritual reality. Over time, the practice becomes less about words and more about a felt sense of presence. The words become a doorway into silence, and in that silence, the divine already reveals itself. There may come moments during this resting when you feel a shift, a softening, a lifting, a sense of quiet peace that has no human origin. That peace is not the result of your effort. It is the sign that you have touched, even briefly, the living presence that is always active, always available, always expressing itself in and through you. And so the practice of resting in the Word is simply this: to rest in truth long enough for the truth to become real. to abide quietly until the spiritual fact shines through, to be still, not that God may enter, but that you may perceive the God who has never left. Let us now move into the living of this truth, for spiritual understanding must ultimately become spiritual life. It is one thing to glimpse, in moments of quiet contemplation, the reality of the divine already. It is another to allow this realization to shape the way we walk through the world. And so we come to a great transition in consciousness, the shift from petition to recognition, from striving to resting, from seeking God's action to trusting God's presence. Most of our human experience is built upon the belief that we, as separate individuals, must constantly appeal to a power outside ourselves for help, for direction, for healing, for supply. Petition assumes lack, it assumes distance, it assumes a God who must be awakened or persuaded. But recognition assumes something altogether different. Recognition assumes that the fullness of God is already present, that the activity of Spirit is already unfolding, and that our role is not to summon it, but to become aware of it. In the beginning of spiritual awakening, one may still find oneself slipping into petition, for it is familiar. But gradually, as one rests more deeply in the Word, there comes a moment when you sense, not intellectually but spiritually, that there is nothing to ask for. Not because you have grown indifferent, but because you perceive that the very presence within you is the source of every possible answer. Consider how your decisions change when you live from recognition. You no longer strain to choose correctly, for you realize that the wisdom of God is already functioning as the mind that you are. Guidance becomes intuitive. It comes as a quiet nudge, a gentle knowing, a sense of rightness that arises without reasoning. You have not asked for direction. You have recognized the presence that directs. Consider how your relationships change. Instead of asking God to heal, to fix, to soften others, you begin to recognize the divine love already expressing itself at the center of every being. You no longer approach others with the expectation that they must change to give you peace. You recognize that peace is already within, and as this peace becomes real to you, it radiates outward, transforming relationships without effort. Consider how your sense of supply changes. You no longer pray anxiously for needs to be met. You no longer outline sources or cling to specific outcomes. Instead, you recognize that infinite supply, not material wealth, but the spiritual substance behind all form, is already present as the activity of your consciousness. Opportunities appear, doors open, resources flow, not because you have asked, but because you have aligned with the truth of spiritual abundance. Living from recognition also changes how you face challenges. Fear dissolves, not because circumstances become easier, but because you no longer face them as a separate self. You recognize the presence that goes before you, the presence that is in the midst of every situation. Instead of rushing into action, you pause, not to beg for help, but to acknowledge the divine activity already taking place. And in that pause, the situation begins to reveal harmony, where the human mind saw only discord. This, my friends, is the great shift in spiritual life. Prayer becomes not a cry for God to act, but a quiet awareness that God is acting. Meditation becomes not a plea for clarity, but a resting in the intelligence already present. Life becomes not a struggle to make things happen, but a willingness to follow the gentle guidance of the presence that leads without effort. And so the spiritual path becomes simpler, gentler, more graceful. You live not as one striving to attain God, but as one who walks with a constant awareness that God is already with you, in you, and as you. The burden lifts, the anxiety fades, the frantic search comes to an end, for you have discovered the truth. All that I seek, I already am. All that I need is already given. All that I desire is already present in the invisible within me. This is living from recognition. This is living by grace. And grace is nothing more than the divine already made visible through your awareness. As we come to the close of this time together, let us gather into a single, quiet awareness. Everything we have touched, everything we have recognized, everything that has stirred within us. If there is one truth I would have you carry from this moment into the moments that follow, it is this: God has never been absent from your experience. Not for a breath, not for a heartbeat, not for a single instant of your existence. The divine, already the fullness of God's presence, wisdom, love, and activity has been the very ground upon which you have walked even when you did not know it. Nothing must be added to God, nothing can be taken from God, and nothing you do or fail to do can interrupt the eternal activity of the infinite. Your task, if we may call it a task at all, is simply to remember again and again that the answer is not something to be brought forth by the force of your prayers, nor by the intensity of your desire, nor by the complexity of your spiritual practices. The answer is something you awaken to, realize, recognize, allow. In the quiet moments of your day, those small spaces between activities, those gentle pauses before speech, those silent intervals when the world is not tugging at your attention, turn inward and acknowledge the presence. Not with words, unless the words help lead you to silence. Not with ritual, unless the ritual leads you to peace, but with a simple recognition: where I am, God is. The activity of God is the activity of my being. I rest in what already is. If you make this recognition a living part of your day, a quiet companion you carry into every experience, the nature of your life will begin to shift. You will discover that guidance appears before you ask for it, that harmony unfolds without your effort, that supply flows without anxiety, that relationships soften in the light of love you did not generate but discovered. You will see, perhaps not suddenly, perhaps not dramatically, but steadily, gently, that the world you once struggled to change is responding to a new consciousness within you, a consciousness that is no longer pleading with God, no longer waiting for God, but abiding in God. For the divine already is not an idea, it is not a technique, it is the truth of your being. And as this truth becomes real to you, as it becomes the atmosphere in which you live, you will find life taking on a rhythm of grace, not because God has changed, but because you have awakened. So let us close, not with a plea, but with a quiet knowing, not with a request, but with an acknowledgement, not with a reaching out, but with a resting within. Father, I thank Thee that Thou art ever present, ever active, ever expressing Thyself as the life that I am. I need not seek Thee. I need only recognize Thee. Carry this awareness with you as you rise from this moment into the next. Let it go before you and within you. Let it soften your fears, guide your choices, and illumine your path. And may you come to see with increasing clarity that the stillness you seek, the wisdom you desire, the answer you long for, has always been here waiting only for your recognition